The evening was quiet in the small neighborhood where Henry Carter lived. He was an old man now, nearly 70 years of age, and his days passed simply. He wore plain clothes, polished his old shoes himself, and carried a wooden cane that had been with him for years. Neighbors often saw him walking slowly down the street, greeting people with a nod or a gentle smile. Most thought of him as just another senior who had retired long ago, living out the rest of his life in peace. Henry never told anyone who he really was, nor did he show off his position. He believed that respect should not come from titles or wealth, but from character. On that particular night, the city streets were still busy. Cars moved quickly, sirens echoed faintly from a distance, and groups of young men stood outside shops talking. Henry, carrying a small bag of groceries, was making his way home from the store. His steps were slow but steady, and his mind was calm. He had seen many things in life, good and bad, and nothing seemed to disturb his peace anymore. But two police officers in a patrol car noticed him. Officer Blake, the older of the two, had a reputation for being harsh, especially toward minorities. Officer Turner, his younger partner, followed his lead without question. They had worked together for years, and both believed they could do whatever they wanted without consequence. To them, people like Henry were easy targets. "Look at him," Blake said, pointing at Henry as he crossed the street. "Old man walking around late at night with a bag. Bet he's hiding something." Turner chuckled. "Easy catch. We'll write it up as suspicious activity. Nobody will question it." They pulled their car up beside Henry. The flashing lights suddenly lit up the street. Henry stopped walking and turned his head slowly toward them, his expression calm and unreadable. "Evening, officers," he said politely. Blake stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his belt. "What's in the bag, old man? Out here late at night looks suspicious to me." Henry lifted the bag slightly. "Just groceries, sir. Bread, milk, and some fruit. I was heading home." Turner got out as well and circled around Henry. "Mind if we take a look?" he asked, though his tone was not really asking, it was demanding. Without waiting for Henry's answer, Blake snatched the bag and rummaged through it. He pulled out the items one by one, holding them up as if expecting to find something illegal hidden among them. When he saw nothing but food, he smirked. "Looks clean," Turner said with disappointment. But Blake was not about to let the opportunity slip. From his pocket, he pulled out a small packet, something he had carried many times before for situations just like this. With a quick motion, hidden from Henry's eyes, he dropped it into the bag. Then he shouted, well, what do we have here?" Turner leaned in, pretending to be surprised. "Looks like drugs. Caught red-handed, old man." Henry looked at the bag calmly, then at the officers. His eyes, though tired with age, carried a sharpness that the two men didn't notice. He did not argue, did not raise his voice, and did not resist. Instead, he placed both hands on his cane and stood quietly. "You'll have to come with us," Blake said smugly. "You're under arrest." They cuffed Henry roughly, ignoring his age, ignoring the fact that he walked with a cane. A few people passing by stopped to watch, whispering among themselves, but no one dared to interfere. To them, it looked like the police had caught another criminal. As they shoved Henry into the back of the patrol car, Turner laughed. "This one's too easy. He won't last a day in jail." Blake nodded, satisfied. "Another win for us. Nobody cares about an old man anyway." Inside the car, Henry sat silently, his eyes fixed on the dark window. His mind was not on fear or anger. He had seen injustice before, and he knew how it worked. What the officers didn't know was that he was not just an old man carrying groceries. He was Judge Henry Carter, a man who had spent decades in the courtroom, handing down sentences to those who broke the law. He had chosen a simple life outside the courthouse so no one would treat him differently. Tonight, however, fate had given him an unexpected role to play. The officers drove with music playing loudly, laughing and joking as if they had just won a game. They didn't even glance back at Henry, convinced he was powerless. At the station, they booked him with little care. Papers were signed quickly, and the planted packet was recorded as evidence. Henry remained calm, answering questions politely, never raising his voice. The younger officer handling the paperwork noticed his politeness and respect, but brushed it off, thinking it was fear. In the holding cell, Henry sat on the bench, leaning slightly on his cane. Other men in the cell looked at him curiously. Some asked what he was in for. Henry gave a small smile and said, "A misunderstanding." His words were so calm that it unsettled them. Prisoners were usually angry, shouting about unfair treatment, but this man seemed different. As the night passed, Blake and Turner left the station proudly, already talking about how their arrest numbers were going up. They bragged about how easy it was to clean the streets and how no one would question them. But Henry knew something they didn't. He had already seen enough corruption in his life to recognize it immediately. He also knew that the truth had a way of coming out sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but it always did. He closed his eyes and leaned back against the cold wall, his thoughts steady. The officers thought they had trapped an old man. What they didn't know was that the man they mocked and set up was the very person who, in just a few days, would sit at the bench in his robe, with the power to decide their future. The morning light streamed through the narrow window of the holding cell. Henry Carter slowly opened his eyes and sat up, steadying himself with his cane. Around him, other men shuffled and muttered, some waiting impatiently for their hearings, others already used to the cycle of arrests. Henry, however, remained calm, his face carrying the same quiet dignity it had the night before. To anyone who looked at him, he seemed like an ordinary old man caught in an unfortunate situation. None of them could guess the truth that lay behind his silence. As breakfast was brought in, a guard handed Henry a tray of plain food. The guard, a young man new to the job, looked at Henry with curiosity. "You don't seem worried," he said under his breath. Henry only smiled faintly. "Worry solves nothing, son. Time reveals everything." The guard blinked, puzzled by the words, and moved on. Meanwhile, officers Blake and Turner were in their own world. They strutted into the courthouse later that morning, laughing and joking as though they had achieved something grand. They slapped each other on the back, boasting about how quickly they had taken down a suspicious old man and how their report looked perfect. Blake had been in the system long enough to know how to bend the rules without getting caught. He believed this case would be just another mark of success on his record. Turner, although less confident, followed along. He often felt uneasy about planting evidence, but Blake always reminded him that no one cared about the people they targeted. "We're the law," Blake would say with a smirk. "Our word is stronger than theirs." And Turner, not strong enough to resist, would nod and go along. Henry's name was on the docket for a preliminary hearing that same week. He was led out of the holding cell, escorted through the hallways, and placed in a waiting room. He sat quietly, his hands folded neatly in his lap, while other defendants fidgeted nervously. Some whispered about their charges, others prayed silently, but Henry seemed oddly at peace. His calm presence even made a few others settle down. When it was time, a clerk entered the room and called names. When Henry's name was spoken, he rose slowly, leaning on his cane, and walked with steady steps. The officers who had arrested him were already in the courtroom, sitting proudly with their lawyer. They exchanged smug glances, certain this would be another easy conviction. The courtroom was buzzing with chatter. Reporters, always eager for a story, filled the benches. They were not there specifically for Henry's case, but for other matters on the calendar. Still, their eyes were sharp, and they were ready to cover whatever unfolded. The bailiff called for order, and the door at the back of the room opened. Silence swept over the crowd as the judge entered. The officers turned to look, and in that moment, their confidence cracked. The man who took the bench, wearing the black robe of authority, was none other than the very old man they had arrested days earlier. Blake's mouth fell open, and Turner nearly dropped his folder. For a brief second, they thought they were seeing a ghost. But it was no illusion. Judge Henry Carter adjusted his robe, sat down with grace, and looked out across the courtroom. His gaze fell on the officers, and though his face remained calm, his eyes spoke volumes. The whispers in the gallery grew louder. Reporters leaned forward, scribbling notes quickly. Camera shutters clicked, trying to capture the shocked expressions of the officers. The air was thick with tension. "Court is now in session," the bailiff announced. Henry's voice carried firmly, steady and clear. "We are here today to hear the matter of evidence tampering and corruption involving two officers of the law, Blake and Turner." The officers shifted uneasily in their seats. Their lawyer leaned over, whispering furiously, trying to come up with an explanation. But it was too late. The story was already out of their control. As the proceedings began, Henry allowed the prosecution to present the case. Witnesses were called to testify. Members of the community spoke of how Blake and Turner often stopped people without reason, how they planted charges, and how they intimidated anyone who dared to speak against them. Each testimony added weight to the growing case. Blake tried to maintain his bravado. He whispered to Turner, "It's just talk. No proof." But Turner could feel the walls closing in. His hands trembled slightly as he shuffled papers, trying to hide his nervousness. Henry sat quietly, listening carefully, never raising his voice, never letting emotion control him. He knew the power of patience, and he let the truth unfold piece by piece. The officer's lawyer argued loudly, claiming that the old man they had arrested was confused, that the charges were exaggerated, that the witnesses were unreliable. But with every attempt, Henry asked sharp, direct questions that exposed the holes in their defense. His legal knowledge, built over decades, cut through every excuse like a blade. By midday, the entire courtroom understood the reality. This was not about an old man wrongly accused. This was about corruption hidden in plain sight. And the irony was too striking to ignore. The officers had unknowingly targeted the very judge who now had the power to decide their fate. During a short recess, the courtroom buzzed with excitement. Reporters rushed to file quick stories, and headlines began to appear online: "Corrupt cops arrest judge, now stand trial before him." The officers sat pale and silent, no longer boasting, no longer laughing. Their arrogance had been replaced by fear. Back in the chamber, Henry looked at them and spoke calmly. "Gentlemen, the law is not a tool for personal gain. It is a shield for the innocent and a sword against the guilty. Those who abuse it betray the trust of the people they swore to serve." His words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The officers lowered their heads, realizing that the man they thought powerless was the very person who would reveal their crimes to the world. The day ended with the case far from over, but the direction was clear. The once confident officers were now defendants, their reputations shattered, their future uncertain. Henry, still calm, adjourned the session and rose from his seat. He gave no sign of triumph, no sign of anger, only the steady dignity of a man who believed in justice. As he left the bench, the reporters followed with flashing cameras and endless questions. People in the gallery whispered with awe, speaking of how the old judge had turned the tables on corruption. And though the trial was just beginning, everyone knew the officer's fate was sealed. Henry returned home late that evening, placing his robe carefully on its hanger. He brewed himself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and gazed out at the quiet street. The world saw him as a hero that day, but he did not crave the attention. For him, it was never about revenge. It was about justice, true justice that could not be mocked or twisted. The night settled in, and Henry closed his eyes, ready for what was to come. Tomorrow would bring more witnesses, more evidence, and more truth. And he would be ready. The next morning, the courthouse was even more crowded than before. News of the shocking twist had spread everywhere, and now reporters filled the benches with notebooks and cameras. Curious citizens came as well, eager to see the case of the two officers who had unknowingly set up a judge. The courthouse had rarely been this full, and the atmosphere buzzed with whispers and tension. Henry Carter walked into the courtroom dressed in his robe, calm and composed. He carried himself with dignity, not gloating over the officer's fear but determined to let the law speak for itself. The moment he stepped inside, the room fell silent. Everyone rose, and the bailiff's voice rang out, "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." Henry nodded slightly, then sat down and motioned for everyone else to be seated. His eyes rested briefly on the officers, and though his expression was calm, his gaze was steady, reminding them that the law was watching. Officer Blake sat stiffly, his jaw tight. He still tried to act confident, but his eyes betrayed his unease. Officer Turner looked worse. His hands shook slightly as he shuffled the documents in front of him, and sweat rolled down his forehead. Their lawyer leaned close to whisper encouragement, but even he seemed unsettled. The case was gaining too much attention, and defending them was becoming harder by the hour. The prosecutor began calling witnesses. The first was a young man named David, who had lived in the same neighborhood where Henry was arrested. David told the court how the officers had harassed him many times, stopping him without cause, searching his car, and once even accusing him of carrying illegal items he didn't have. His voice trembled as he spoke, but he did not back down. "I was scared of them," he admitted. "But when I heard what happened to Judge Carter, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore." The jury listened carefully, their faces serious. Reporters scribbled furiously. The officers shifted in their seats, whispering to each other, but their nervous glances betrayed their growing fear. Next came Mrs. Robinson, an elderly woman from the same neighborhood. She walked slowly with her cane, her steps unsteady but her voice firm. She told the court how she had seen the officers stop Henry on the night of his arrest. "He didn't do anything wrong," she said. "He was just carrying groceries. But they grabbed him, searched his bag, and then suddenly acted like they found something. I knew it wasn't right." Her testimony was powerful. The courtroom was quiet as her words echoed in the air. Even the jury leaned forward, paying close attention. The defense lawyer tried to shake her story, asking if she had really seen clearly, given her age. But Mrs. Robinson straightened her back and looked him directly in the eye. "I may be old, sir, but my eyes work just fine. I know what I saw." Her answer drew nods from the gallery and made the lawyer frown in frustration. Henry allowed each witness to speak fully. He asked careful questions, his tone respectful but sharp, drawing out details that revealed the truth. Piece by piece, the picture of corruption became clearer. The officers had not made one mistake. They had a pattern of abuse, using their badges as weapons rather than shields. Then came the request for body cam footage. The prosecutor demanded to see it. Blake and Turner had already claimed that their cameras had technical issues that night. But the prosecutor pointed out that this excuse appeared in several of their past reports as well. "Is it just coincidence," he asked, "that every time evidence could clear a suspect, your cameras fail?" Turner's face paled. He stammered, unable to answer. Blake tried to speak confidently, but his words rang hollow. "Malfunctions happen," he said. "That's not our fault." Henry leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but cutting. "Officers, the law demands accountability. If your cameras always fail when truth is needed most, then either you are the most unfortunate men in this department or you are hiding something." The gallery murmured with agreement. Reporters' pens scratched rapidly across their papers. The lawyer for the officers tried to object, but the damage was already done. More witnesses followed. A store clerk testified that he had seen the officers plant items in other arrests. A retired officer came forward, saying he had left the department because of corruption he could no longer tolerate. Each story built upon the last, painting a grim picture of two men who had abused their authority again and again. As the evidence mounted, Turner began to crumble. His hands shook constantly, and he avoided looking at the jury. At one point, he whispered desperately to Blake, "We're done. They're going to bury us." Blake hissed back, "Shut up. Don't say a word." But even Blake's confidence was slipping. He could feel the weight of the evidence pressing down on him. The day stretched on, each hour making their situation worse. The courtroom, once filled with curiosity, was now filled with certainty. Everyone could see the truth: these officers were guilty, and their arrogance had led them to target the very man who would bring them down. Finally, Henry addressed the room. His voice was steady, his words chosen carefully. "The badge is not a license for corruption," he said. "It is a symbol of trust. When that trust is broken, the damage is not only to the victims but to the very fabric of justice. These officers stand accused not just of targeting me, but of betraying the people they swore to protect." The silence in the room was heavy. Even the air felt still as his words sank in. The officers sat frozen, their faces pale, their eyes wide. They had started this case laughing and confident, but now they looked like men who had seen their own future collapse. Henry adjourned the court for the day. The reporters rushed out, eager to publish the latest developments. Headlines would soon cover the nation: "Judge exposes corrupt cops who tried to frame him." As the courtroom emptied, Henry remained for a moment longer. He looked at the empty chairs, the silent jury box, and the officers being led out in handcuffs. He did not smile, he did not gloat. He simply sat quietly, reflecting on the strange twist of fate that had brought him here. Later that evening, as Henry returned home, he placed his robe neatly on its hanger, just as he always did. He sat by the window with a cup of tea, his eyes watching the fading light. The city outside was restless, but inside his home, there was peace. He knew the trial was not yet finished, but the truth was already shining through. And he also knew that justice, though sometimes slow, was unstoppable. The following day, the courthouse was filled to the brim once again. The case had grown into something much larger than anyone expected. Reporters from across the city were present, their cameras ready. Curious citizens stood in long lines outside, waiting for a chance to sit in the gallery. Even other judges and lawyers had slipped in, quietly observing. The trial had become more than just about two corrupt officers. It was now a symbol of justice being tested in front of the world. Judge Henry Carter entered the courtroom with the same calm dignity as before. His face carried no anger, no pride, only the steady patience of a man who had spent his life inside the walls of justice. The bailiff called for order, and silence fell immediately. Blake and Turner sat at the defense table, their shoulders stiff, their expressions hollow. They no longer looked like confident officers. Instead, they looked like men trapped in a corner with no way out. Their lawyer whispered to them in hushed tones, but both seemed too shaken to listen carefully. The prosecutor rose and began presenting the final pieces of evidence. More reports of missing body cam footage were shown to the jury. Records revealed that nearly a dozen cases linked to these two officers had been dismissed in the past because of technical issues or lost files. But when placed together, the pattern was undeniable. The jury leaned forward, absorbing every detail. Members of the gallery exchanged glances, whispering to each other. Reporters scribbled furiously, their headlines already forming. Each new revelation felt like another nail sealing the officer's fate. Blake shifted in his seat, his face red with anger. He slammed his hand on the table, drawing a startled gasp from the gallery. "This is unfair," he shouted. "We risk our lives every day, and this is how we're treated? You don't know what it's like on the streets." His lawyer tried to calm him, but the damage was done. His outburst only made him look desperate. Judge Carter remained calm, his voice steady. "Order in the court. Officer Blake, you will speak only when spoken to. This court will not be turned into a stage for excuses." His words carried the weight of authority, and Blake slumped back into his chair, glaring but silent. Turner looked worse. He kept glancing at the jury, at the reporters, at the judge, his fear obvious. Sweat rolled down his forehead, and his hands trembled so badly he could barely hold his pen. At one point, he whispered, "We're finished," and buried his face in his hands. The prosecution called one final witness, a retired detective named Howard. He had worked in the same precinct years earlier. His voice was steady, though his eyes carried sadness. "I left the department," he said, "because I could not stand the corruption anymore. Officers like Blake and Turner made it impossible for honest men to do their jobs. I filed complaints, but nothing happened. Their actions damaged not just the people they targeted, but the reputation of every honest officer out there." His testimony was powerful, and the courtroom fell into heavy silence when he finished. Everyone understood the weight of his words. This was no longer about two men. It was about restoring faith in the law. Henry looked around the courtroom and spoke with calm clarity. "This trial has revealed more than a single act of injustice. It has revealed a pattern of corruption that strikes at the heart of justice itself. The badge is not a shield to harm the weak. It is a trust given by the people. And when that trust is broken, the law must respond." The jury left to deliberate. The room buzzed with tension as people whispered about what the verdict would be. Blake sat still, his jaw clenched, trying to look strong but failing. Turner kept his head down, whispering prayers under his breath. Their lawyer sat with folded arms, his face pale, knowing the case had slipped beyond his control. Hours passed. The sun lowered in the sky, painting the courthouse windows with soft golden light. Finally, the jury returned. The foreman stood, holding the slip of paper. The entire room leaned forward, breathless. The foreman spoke clearly. "We, the jury, find the defendants, Officer Blake and Officer Turner, guilty of corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of power." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. The gallery erupted with gasps and whispers. Reporters rushed to file the breaking news. The officers sat frozen, their faces pale. Blake's fists clenched tightly, his jaw trembling with rage. Turner's eyes filled with tears. Henry raised his hand for silence. When the room quieted, he spoke. "The jury has spoken. Justice has spoken. This is not a moment for celebration, but for reflection. The law is not a tool for fear. It is a promise to the people that their rights will be protected." He turned his gaze directly to the officers. "You broke that promise. You betrayed the trust given to you. And now, you will face the consequences." The sentencing was set for the following day. The officers were led out in handcuffs, their heads bowed. The gallery watched in silence, their once proud uniforms now symbols of shame. Reporters shouted questions, flashes from cameras filled the air, but the officers said nothing. That night, the city buzzed with the news. Headlines filled every paper and website: "Corrupt cops found guilty after targeting judge." Talk shows debated the case, calling it a turning point for justice. Citizens in neighborhoods once afraid now spoke with renewed hope. Perhaps the system could still protect them. At home, Henry removed his robe and placed it carefully on its hanger. He brewed a cup of tea and sat quietly in his chair by the window. The night was cool, and the city lights twinkled in the distance. He thought about the years he had spent in the courtroom, about the many faces he had seen: victims, criminals, lawyers, officers. Some days were heavy with despair, but nights like this reminded him why he had chosen this path. He was not proud in the way others expected. He did not crave the headlines, the applause, or the praise. What mattered to him was simple: the truth had been revealed, and justice had been served. As the night deepened, Henry leaned back in his chair, his cane resting by his side. Tomorrow, he would deliver the final sentence. Tomorrow, he would close this chapter. But tonight, he allowed himself a quiet moment of peace, knowing that the law had stood firm. For Blake and Turner, the night was far from peaceful. They sat in their cells, staring at the walls, thinking about what was to come. The laughter, the arrogance, the belief that they were untouchable, all of it was gone. In its place was fear, heavy and inescapable. They knew what awaited them, the judgment of the very man they had once mocked. The sun rose over the city the next morning, casting golden light across the courthouse steps. Crowds had already begun to gather outside, waiting for the final chapter of the trial that had captured the attention of the nation. Reporters lined the sidewalks, their cameras ready, while citizens whispered eagerly about the sentence that would soon be delivered. The names Blake and Turner were now spoken with anger and disgust. Everyone was waiting to hear how justice would respond. Inside his modest home, Judge Henry Carter prepared for the day slowly. He rose from bed, made a simple breakfast of toast and tea, and dressed with care. He looked at his black robe hanging neatly on its hook and ran a hand across its fabric. For decades, that robe had symbolized his duty, and today it carried even more weight than ever before. He lifted it gently, put it on, and stood before the mirror. His face was lined with years of experience, but his eyes were steady and calm. He was ready. When Henry arrived at the courthouse, the room was already filled to capacity. The gallery buzzed with tension, the press sat with pens and cameras poised, and the jury returned to their seats, ready to witness the final decision. At the defense table, Blake and Turner sat in silence, their uniforms gone, replaced with plain suits that did nothing to hide their fear. Their lawyer looked weary, defeated by the mountain of evidence and the verdict that had already been delivered. The bailiff's voice rang out. "All rise for the Honorable Judge Carter." The room stood, and Henry entered with calm dignity. He sat at the bench and looked over the courtroom. Silence fell immediately, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone. Henry began, his voice steady. "This case has revealed truths that are painful but necessary. The defendants, sworn officers of the law, abused their power not once, but many times. They planted evidence, intimidated the innocent, and betrayed the very trust that gave them authority. Their actions were not mistakes. They were choices. Choices made again and again, without remorse." The courtroom remained silent, every word sinking deep into the air. Blake shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tight with frustration, while Turner's head hung low, his eyes filled with dread. Henry continued. "The law must be equal for all. No man, no matter his uniform or badge, stands above it. And when those entrusted with authority break that trust, the law must answer firmly." He paused, letting the weight of his words linger. "The jury has found you guilty of corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of power. It is now this court's duty to deliver a sentence." Blake suddenly stood up, his voice loud and desperate. "Please, Your Honor. We've served for years. We've put our lives on the line for the city. Don't throw it all away for one mistake." His voice cracked as he spoke, his arrogance gone, replaced by fear. Turner followed, his voice trembling. "Judge Carter, I beg you. I was only following orders. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Please show mercy." The gallery stirred with whispers. Some shook their heads, unconvinced by their pleas. Others watched in silence, waiting for Henry's response. Henry raised his hand, and the room grew quiet again. His voice was calm but firm. "You ask for mercy, but where was your mercy for the innocent men and women you accused? Where was your mercy for the families torn apart by your lies? You had chances to choose the right path, and each time, you chose corruption. Today, you face the result of those choices. The room held its breath. The final moment had come. Henry looked directly at the officers and delivered the sentence. For the crimes of corruption, evidence tampering, and abuse of power, this court sentences each of you to 15 years in federal prison. You will serve this time without parole. Let this sentence stand as a message that justice does not bend for power, nor for those who hide behind a badge. The courtroom erupted. Some gasped, others cheered, and reporters scribbled wildly, knowing the headlines would spread across the nation within minutes. The bailiff moved forward to take the officers into custody. Blake shouted in anger, struggling briefly before being restrained. Turner collapsed into his chair, his face pale, tears streaming down his cheeks. The once proud officers were now prisoners, led away in chains before the eyes of the public. As they were taken out, Henry remained calm on the bench. He did not gloat, did not smile. He simply watched, his heart heavy but steady. Justice had been done, not for himself, but for the community and the principle that no one was above the law. When the courtroom settled, Henry addressed the gallery one final time. Let us remember that justice is not vengeance. It is balance. It is the promise that all people, rich or poor, powerful or powerless, are equal under the law. That is what this court stands for, and that is what must guide us all. The people in the gallery rose to their feet in respect, many applauding, some even with tears in their eyes. Reporters rushed to file their stories, calling it one of the most historic cases of the decade. Headlines that night would read, "Judge sentences corrupt officers to 15 years, justice prevails." After the session ended, Henry returned to his chambers, removing his robe carefully and hanging it back on its hook. He sat for a moment in silence, reflecting. He did not see himself as a hero, though the world would call him one. To him, he had only done what was right, what was expected of him as a servant of the law. Later, as he walked home through his quiet neighborhood, people greeted him with respect and gratitude. Some clapped him on the back, others called out his name, and many simply smiled at him with newfound admiration. He responded with a nod and a warm smile, as humble as ever. At home, he placed his cane by the door and settled into his chair by the window. The city outside was alive with chatter about the trial, but inside his home, peace returned. He sipped his tea and looked out at the stars, knowing that justice had spoken clearly. For Blake and Turner, the world they once ruled with arrogance was gone forever. Behind prison bars, they would have years to reflect on the choices that brought them there. And for the people of the city, the case was a reminder that corruption could be defeated, that truth could still triumph, and that even the simplest-looking man might hold the power to change everything. As the night deepened, Henry closed his eyes, not as a man seeking praise, but as a man at peace. He had fulfilled his duty, and justice had prevailed. The story of the old man who turned out to be the judge would be told for years to come, inspiring all who heard it to believe once more in the strength of the law.